All right, so our panel this morning is a really exciting one. It's politics, agency, and leadership, and we have three distinct talks. I'm going to read the titles and then each presenter, and then we'll get underway shortly as well. But I'm going to do them all at the top, so then we'll go through them, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. So our first talk is going to be Stories of Strength and Connection, celebrating Inuit women's leadership in Nunatsiavut. And our two presenters for this paper are Tracy Evan Rice. Tracy Evan Rice is an Inuit from Makhovik, Nunatsiavut. She received her bachelor's degree from Carleton and has worked with Inuit Terapi Katami and the Nunatsiavut government. While there, she planned an Inuit Women's Conference in Nain and hosted lunch and learns, Take Back the Night Marches, held workshops around violence prevention, women in leadership, and women's well-being. And she is now a senior policy analyst with Nunatsiavut Affairs and also a graduate student doing her master's in Arctic and subarctic futures at the Labrador campus of Memorial University. The co-presenters with Tracy is Andrea Proctor. Andrea Proctor is an anthropologist with over 20 years of experience in working with Indigenous communities in Labrador and an adjunct professor at Memorial University. Her book, A Long Journey, Residential Schools in Labrador and Newfoundland from 2020, won the 2021 Atlantic Canada Book Award for Scholarly Writing and the Canadian Historical Association's Clio Prize Atlantic, as well as the NL Book Prize for Nonfiction. And notably as well, she has coordinated the Daughters of Meekock Celebrating Inuit Women's Leadership project for the tradition and transition among Labrador Inuit with the Shirk Partnership. Our second top paper is going to be given by Merit Evsary. Her talk is titled Trusted to Choose, Women in the Politics of Control in Newfoundland, 1890 to 1940. Merit holds an IBA, MSc, and is the current 2025 Rhodes Scholar. And she is currently reading a master's in comparative and international education at the University of Oxford. Her work builds on research into suffrage and eugenics in Newfoundland, which she has studied extensively, and her work continues to examine how history curricula shape political understanding and national identity. Our final presenter for this session is going to be Sonia Boone, who will be giving us a talk titled Widows of the West End and Other Monikers, Pseudonyms and Letters of Smallwood, 1948 to 1951. Sonia is a writer, researcher, flautist, teacher. She's the author and co-author or editor of 7 books, and most recently, of course, the notable collection which survived many obstacles to come into existence. Dear Smallwood, Mr. Smallwood, Confederation of the Words of Those Who Lived It, 2025. Sonia is also a mentor in the MFA program at the University of King's College. So on that note, we're going to get underway with our presenters, and I leave it to Tracy and to Andrea. Thank you so much.
The Stories of Strength and Connection, celebrating Inuit women's leadership in Nunatsiavut. Our own stories are the ones that sustain us. The stories that we tell about our own families and our own communities are the ones that make us strong. By sharing these stories, we can build on our strengths by celebrating each other and by celebrating our ability to persist through stormy times. The Daughters of Meekock initiative centers on the role of Indigenous narratives in providing public images of Indigenous women, especially in light of negative images in the media or in academic literature. Our stories of admiration about our own families and our own communities display and embody the strength of Inuit women like no other stories and no other storytellers can. So the Inuit narratives that emerge from this initiative do much more than simply counterbalance media and research images of victims and violence. These personal stories demonstrate how Inuit women build and strengthen connections between people that have been strained and broken by the impacts of colonialism. So by repairing relationships that colonialism attempts to fragment through residential schools, eradicating the Inuit language, forced relocation, state interference in families, resource exploitation, and sexual violence, these women help themselves and others to persevere through these attacks on their social cohesion. So by focusing on personal stories of strength and admiration, we're celebrating and magnifying Inuit women's strength and ability to decolonize their lives.
So the Daughters of Meekock project was community-driven research initiated by women in Nunatsiavut as part of the Tradition and Transition among Labrador Inuit Research Partnership, who wanted to recognize and to highlight the long history of Inuit women leaders in Nunatsiavut. And so building on this idea, Tracy, who was then the Nunatsiavut government status of women office coordinator, and I worked with an advisory committee of women from every community in Nunatsiavut and surrounding areas to develop this project. And we called it Daughters of Mikak after an Inuit Inuit leader in the 1700s, Mikak. So the advisory group decided to use a strength-based approach, focusing on celebrating people's abilities and experiences. As Tuck and Yang argue, moving away from pain-based or victim research narratives towards desire-based narratives does not deny the experience of tragedy, trauma, and pain, but positions the knowing derived from such experiences as wise and can help to humanize research. So accordingly, the Daughters of Mikak project focused on celebration and admiration and strength, and in doing so, highlights the wisdom and the approach to life that many of the women who were celebrated in this project developed throughout their life, often through difficult times. So one of the first questions that this advisory group tackled was how the project could work to recognize Inuit leaders. And at first we came up with lists of women who we wanted to celebrate, but we really quickly realized that was an impossible task. First of all, because there were too many women to list, and second of all, no one on the advisory committee really wanted to make those decisions about who to include on this list and who not to include. So we finally came up with an approach that seemed to fit better. We decided we would encourage people in Nunatsiavut to create tributes to Inuit women themselves. So Inuit women in their lives who they admired and found inspirational and had, a strong influence on their lives. And because humility is a very important characteristic in Nunatsiavut, we wanted to encourage people to talk about somebody else. A lot of people are not comfortable about boasting about themselves or talking about themselves. So we wanted to create something so people could recognize somebody else. And we decided to leave the definition of leadership open so that people could celebrate leadership in all of its forms. There are many ways that Inuit women shape their communities. A lot of leadership is done by women who probably don't see themselves as leaders. And these roles are often not acknowledged.
So in the end, people throughout Nunatsiavut created 44 digital stories about inspirational Inuit women. The stories are very diverse. Some are about young women, some are about older women, some are about recognized community leaders, and some are about women who focus mostly on their family. But there are several themes that emerge about what people admire in these women. One of the most prominent characteristics identified is the women's ability to create and maintain strong social connections with family, friends, and others, and those in need. While many people identified the idea that family is first, strong importance is given to helping and connecting with people outside the family as well, and to expanding the boundaries of family to include those around you. So most of the stories focus on the efforts of the women to hold people together through strong relationships as families or as larger social groups, forming and strengthening connections and relationships with people in the ways that the Daughters of Mikak women do have many positive impacts on people. Beyond the family and Nunatsiavut community level, the forging of relationships can help people find their own Inuit grounding and identity. In telling these stories, the project participants describe the strong relationships that the women are adept at creating and maintaining, but they also strengthen relationships themselves through expressing admiration and gratitude, both with the women that they are talking about and with others who feel the same way about that woman. So others describe similar ways in which the women would model or teach about creating supportive and healthy relationships. While some of the women were teachers in the formal schooling system, all the women taught those around them in some way.
So two of the other aspects that people commonly looked at in these 44 stories were two aspects. So one was the ability to speak Inuktitut, and the other was the time spent on the land, time living on the land, and both are core features of, or both are things that lots of people in Nunatsiavut see as core features of Inuit identity. And both have been heavily attacked over the last, especially the last 50 years, because of compulsory schooling in English, forced relocations from northern Labrador, the centralization of people into communities. People were forced to live in the communities. You know, increased government regulation of land, of life on the land and on the sea, the collapse of the cod fishery, the char fisheries there. So there've been many forces that have combined to make both speaking of Inuktitut and life and spending time on the land very difficult. So women who can speak Inuktitut and women who do spend time in the land have therefore successfully fought to retain Inuit customs, despite this, onslaught of these forces that often prevent people from doing so. And in addition to being signs of cultural strength, the ability to speak Inuktitut and to spend time on the land are described in the narratives as also as means of bringing people together. So a lot of people talk about speaking Inuktitut with each other or spending time on the land as a way of really binding people together. And that was something that a lot of people in telling these stories, telling their narratives about why they found these women to be inspirational, they often identified that as something that these women could do that tied people together. They also talk about the women's patience and their willingness to teach others, as well as a really profound, people often admired the women's profound sense of humility and not wanting an acknowledgement for their own personal accomplishments. Something else that many people talked about in their narratives was the women's courage to speak their minds and to tackle injustice. And lots of people talk about this outspokenness as really impressive, and for especially a small number of older women who would always speak out, would always give moral advice to other people when they weren't behaving as they should. And another common thread that comes out in all of the stories is strength of will in maintaining social connections, in improving Inuit lives, and in providing stability for those around them. And sometimes people would describe this in terms of witnessing how these women became who they are through their own experiences, and their kindness and strength they had really admired that, especially knowing how some of the women had a backdrop of tragedy and poverty and hard times in their own lives.
So if we look at all these common threads, helping and sharing with others, looking after family members, teaching kindness, patience, being on the land, speaking into it, outspokenness, humility, and strength. We can start to see how they all illustrate these women's ability to improve the lives of those around them by creating and maintaining healthy connections within family networks and community social networks. It is the ability of these women to demonstrate and teach how to build relationships and strong connections with those around them that is valued as inspirational, as well as their ability to stand up against injustice. These stories are generally made for a Nunavut audience, and they do not outline the background story of colonization that everyone's familiar with. Some allude to it, but only in passing, and only to celebrate the strength and wisdom that are gained by facing challenging times and by getting through difficulties in life. So experiences of colonialism may act as a catalyst for inspirational transformation, but the experiences themselves are not at the center of the stories. Instead, it's the wisdom that emerges and the ability to persevere that are celebrated. If we think of colonization as working to destroy links between people, this value placed on Inuit women who demonstrate their ability to rebuild or strengthen social connections makes perfect sense. Colonization attempts to destroy links between family members through residential schools and by encouraging the loss of Indigenous languages. It destroys links between Indigenous peoples and their land by removing them from it and encouraging community-based life. It destroys links between Inuit by attacking the Indigenous governance structures within families, communities, and territories. But in these stories, the focus is not the destructive and violent colonial forces, but the strength of these women to transform their experiences into positive aspects and their ability to withstand and to counter these forces. The digital stories from the Daughters of Meekat project convey a powerful celebration of women who, in their own unique ways, have demonstrated how to build healthy relationships and how to successfully challenge and reverse the impacts of colonization in dignified and Inuit-specific ways.
So we weren't sure how much time we have. We do have one of these stories that we can show you. It's about, I think, 3 or 4 minutes long. Rebecca, should I show it or should we leave it to the end, or how are we doing for time?
We're a little tight, but I think we can make time for that. I think so. So go for it,
Okay.
and then we'll, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So if anyone's interested, all of the digital stories are on the Nunatsiavut government web page now. But we'll just watch this one.
Hi, my name is Julie Dicker, and I'm from Nain, Nunatsiavut. Another inspirational Inuit woman to me would be my ma, Sue Harris, and she's my mom's mom. When I think of my ma, I think of her as a pillar of kindness, pillar of truth, and pillar of strength. Because no matter what happens in her life or in her family's life, it could be a time of celebration, it could be a time of hardships, it could be a time of triumphs, it could be times of tragedy. There could be good times, bad times, ugly times, but no matter what happens, she kind of rides the waves right on through and comes out standing on top as if nothing happened. It's like just normal. She's always keeps herself grounded, and she remains steadfast and true to everything. No matter what happens, she never sways far from her normal. Always very grounded. Being true to herself and to everybody else around her is important too. Growing up, or even now, say we do something wrong or something she knows isn't right, she'd be the first one to tell us that, okay, don't do that, it's not right, you gotta do it the right way. Just an example of how strong she is, a few years ago, she fell and hurt her hip, and she went around for a few days with the pain in her hip, but after a couple of days she went down to the clinic, and the clinic or the nurse told her that, okay, if it's still sore in a couple of days, come back and we'll check it out again. So after a few days, she went back down and checked it out again. The nurse then sent her on to Goose Bay for an x-ray. And from Goose Bay, they sent her right to Sinetsini to see an orthopedic specialist. And when she walked in to see the orthopedic specialist, she walked into his office and he looked at her and he said, "She's walking? That woman must be made of nails." Because all that time, for like a week and a half or 2 weeks, her hip had been fractured. So my Ma Sue Harris is one strong woman that never gives up.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get out of here. Okay, so that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tracy and Andrea. We're just going to get set up right now for Merritt's presentation. We'll be right underway with the next talk.
So my name is Merit Absuri. I'm a researcher in women's political history. I've done work on women's suffrage in Newfoundland, and I've also most recently done work on women's political history concerning eugenics movement in Newfoundland as well. And today, this is a new talk for me, and I'm sort of combining a lot of these narratives about women's agency and their opportunity to be able to choose, and how that really has its basis in what we consider a nation to be, who we consider making up that nation, and all of those sorts of things. So I hope you learned something new today, and thank you so much for having me. So I wanted to begin by a brief note about this research. So to start, Newfoundland and Labrador, the current province, is referred to as Newfoundland throughout, just because of where my research was mainly taking place, due to ease of access and things. Everything is from the island of Newfoundland, unfortunately. So a little reference to Labrador. It's also heavily focused on the experiences of white settler women. So I wanted to start with this sort of concept of empire and sense of being. And when I first started my research on women's suffrage hang on one second. When I first started my research, there we go, on women's suffrage in Newfoundland, a lot of it was essentially talking about where these women first, like what kind of narratives were we seeing when women first came over and they were sent here to sort of colonize the island. And I looked at 17th century records of women immigrants in Newfoundland. And there were already issues from the very beginning because they sent men over first, of course. And you can see that even in the 1600s, there were comments by sea captains saying, so long as no woman comes, the problems of population in St. John's are not ever going to be fixed. And later, it was even seen by the government in England that every single man who is sent out to Newfoundland in excess of the number of single women is absolutely useless. So you can see from the very beginnings that women were very much tied to the sense of being almost a brood mare. She was sent over to be able to populate the island. It was so extremely tied to nationhood that even the men who were sent over there were considered useless if women weren't there. But it's very interesting because men were first sent over as the people to populate. They were considered the people. And then you send women over after to make sure that the population grows. So you have this very interesting discourse about women mainly being sent over to be able to have children, and that is their entire purpose there. And you can see this narrative actually taking through a lot of the history of Newfoundland afterwards as well. It was really interesting because I looked at a lot of education, the history of education in the province as well. And throughout the 1800s and 1900s, women, you had like single-sex schools and then you would have mixed-sex schools. And in the mixed-sex schools, there were general courses that women couldn't take, not in the least being politics. They also couldn't take classes in geography, and you were segregated based on what your roles were determined to be in society. There was this actually really interesting paper that I came across, which was written by one of the students in Our Lady of Mercy Academy, which was a girls' school. And it was a paper that she had written, and then it became published in this paper that was then shown to, I think, students of the school, and you could also access it outside. And she said that Marie Curie's greatest accomplishment was being a mother. And the fact that was what was really taught to young girls at the time, it was just very clear that the sense of motherhood, and that is kind of what you were destined to do, rather than everything else. And that was very much tied to this empire and what sense of being women had in it. So something else that I found really fascinating was I wanted to look into where all of these discourses came from. And I mean, you can begin to trace them back, even as far as like ancient Greece. You can look at Plato, you can look at Aristotle, and you can see a lot of these arguments taking place there too. And then you can look in hysteria and all of these sorts of histories and seeing that women were really very much tied to this whole idea of sentimentality and emotion. And the whole thing was that that was always considered weaker. So you'd have men that were connected to reason, that could think, that had the right to have education. And then you'd have women who were more caretakers of the family, and also because of that, they were connected to emotion. But the whole issue there was that it was always seen as being weaker of the two. So one place that I could really see this very clearly was in the Enlightenment, where you'd have philosophers like Rousseau, and he would say, educate women like men. The more they resemble our sex, the less power they will have over us. There's so many issues with the statement, but one of the big ones is that he sees the main difference between the two is that education is masculine. And so you start to educate women, and they're much more likely to become men. And the fact is that reason in itself is not necessarily, you know, a male trait to have. So anyway, all of these discourses I thought were very fascinating. But then you would have Mary Wollstonecraft, and I'm not sure how many people in the room know about her, but if you don't, I highly recommend you read her. She was also a philosopher at the same time, and she said her goal was not for women to have power over men, but over themselves. So she basically argues that this whole idea that reason, it's just not a masculine trait, you know, that's a human trait. And she says every individual is a world within themselves, but the nature of reason, the ability to reason, the ability to have intelligence, to be able to have your opinion counted, must be the same in every single person. So I guess one of the big questions now is, how does this actually connect to things going on in Newfoundland? Well, it's actually really interesting because Armine Nutting-Gosling, who just got a statue put up of her in Bannerman Park, actually referenced Wollstonecraft in her work, or in one of her speeches that she had given. So it's very fascinating because these are not just these broad philosophical ideas. They had roots, and they had roots even in Newfoundland. People understood what this meant. So Armine essentially said Wollstonecraft was a champion of her sex because she had the courage to say what she thought in an age when women were not expected to think at all. So you really see this sort of claim to reason being made. And this was also something that came about in the suffrage movement as well. So you could see a lot of women's claims against anti-suffrage arguments. And one of them, because there were a lot of anti-suffrage arguments saying, you know, keep women in her noble place in the home and all of these sorts of things, and just that she already has power there. But the whole issue is that, you know, they were claiming to have equal power. They weren't claiming to have power over men, as we saw earlier. But then one of the sort of arguments that women had was that it is unfair that women of brains and education should have no representation in civic or legislative affairs. And I thought this was a really, really fascinating thing to say, because it clearly links, you know, women to the capability to be educated, to have reason, to have an opinion. And that's directly linked with having the right to be able to vote, of course. Then I came across another quote when I was doing my research on suffrage, and it said that as women become more educated, and this was really fascinating because this was something that was published in like one of the newspapers. And I was interested in this because I knew this whole discourse about education and about reason, and that men were considered to have reason, women necessarily weren't, and there was this hierarchy. So why would men possibly want to be educated about women at this time? And like what merit would that argument have? And then the argument, another thing that was said in this exact same paper, is that we are taught by eugenics that in a woman's hand is placed the destiny of the race. And then I was like, okay, so that's all of a sudden why they were like, okay, women have the right to be able to be reasonable. And so now I'll touch on eugenics because it's very fascinating how these concepts are interlinked. So every time that I talk about eugenics, I like to start with the Hippocratic Oath, which is an oath that doctors take before they practice, and it's first do no harm, and that's their thing. But what eugenics did was essentially flip this on its head. Eugenics, in its simplest terms, is essentially the science of good breeding. It was defined by Francis Galton in 1861 as the study of all agencies under human control which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations. So basically what would happen is that in all of these concepts of empire building, of empire changing, it was a world that was grappling with social change in the 1860s due to the Industrial Revolution. There was increases in population. There were issues with poor and lower classes reproducing at much faster rates than the rest of the population. And all of a sudden people were worried. And because of all this change, they were saying what's going to happen to the empire that we built, what's going to happen to that. And so essentially the main thing was that there were some people who they considered good, the best kind of in society that should be reproducing, and certain people who we want to limit to reproduce to kind of preserve this idea of nationhood and the empire. Now, what happened was that in a lot of different regions, doctors were kind of educated differently on the impacts of sterilization and how sterilization should be done. So in kind of its strongest form, I mean, we can think of eugenics and tying it to the Second World War and the impacts of what happened with Hitler. But we can also think about sterilizations that did happen, and a lot of this happened in America. So there were places in America where sterilizations were legalized. And what happened was of course, this time period in the 1860s going on to the 1900s, Newfoundland didn't have a medical school. So doctors were educated abroad. So you'd have doctors that were educated in Britain, where eugenics was heavily talked about, doctors who were educated in Canada, where eugenics was also going on, and in the States, where in some states it was legalized. And then what you would often have are these doctors coming back up and working in different parts of the province and in the northern areas. And then because sterilizations were legalized where they came from, and then they thought they were doing kind of the good of society by sterilizing certain people, they were just doing it in Newfoundland as well. And it just shows how these narratives about what we consider good in society, who we consider having a voice in society, can be very, very dangerous. And it's very important to look at it as sort of a broad idea and really question all of that. But another thing about eugenics is today we like to think of it, I think, as a right-wing ideology. But at the time, and I can't stress this enough, it was considered a science. It was considered progressive. You had people from either side of the political spectrum who were talking about eugenics. You had people who were advocating for maternity leave under eugenics because it led to women who were more educated and who had jobs being able to take time off and have children. You'd also have people who are advocating for birth control under eugenics. But what was also very, very interesting about this is that you would have women who were never claimed to sort of have rationality all of a sudden when they were talking about eugenics, because that is solely about who can reproduce and who can't. And when women were so deeply tied to this narrative, that was a way for them to get into political discussions, and that was a way for them to actually have their voice heard. So you'd have women who are advocating for eugenics as well, which I'll go into shortly. But so essentially, we can see that these are some of the eugenic sterilizations that took place at the St. Anthony Hospital under the International Grenfell Association. This work was done by Dr. Jim Connor, and I just sort of put it into a chart here. But you can see like some of the reasons for sterilization. The person would come in to admission for like a septic finger, and the reason for sterilization would be mentally dull. And then you'd have the doctor leaving notes in the margins saying for her safety and the good of society at large, that it is advisable to render her incapable of becoming pregnant. So these are the bigger issues that you see here for her own safety and for the good of society at large. But what happened to that Hippocratic oath? What happened to being able to do good? When you're making decisions for people, that it's just crazy. And then you'd also see these discussions about a woman, for example, who was a resident of an orphanage in St. Anthony, and she was 16. And she likely suffered from appendicitis or, some vague abdominal complaint. And it was said that mentally she's apathetic and rather dull. She has been sent to school, but over a period of years has not been able to learn to read or write. And this is so problematic because when you already have all of these discussions about, women not having any ability to kind of reason, and then all of a sudden you're just being able to use all of this, all of what they were meant for kind of in the empire to be able to have children, and then you take all of that away from them as well. So it's just completely removing their voice. And it's just, it was so crazy to kind of learn about how this happened here as well. And then this was written, this was a speech that was actually given to the ladies' reading room. And one of the women who was talking there, Mrs. Dr. McPherson, so her husband was a doctor, and he would have been very much involved in a lot of the discourses surrounding eugenics at the time as well. But she wrote this whole paper on the science of eugenics, and she said, mothers make empires. So then again, you see this whole claim of women while women were very, very oppressed by eugenics, you also have women who are able to get into discourses and able to talk about things politically and be heard because of this discourse, because reproduction was the main thing that women were seen for. And all of a sudden, when you have politics about that, women are actually considered. But then, of course, you'd have men commenting on this too. So, for example, Dr. Brady in 1916 was putting things out saying all wise young women should study eugenics. And of course, like the craziness of those kind of discourses, right? But then reproduction was always kind of used as a tool for control in nation building. For example, Lord Morris, who was a former Prime Minister of Newfoundland in 1923, wrote to the Evening Telegram and said, "Without free birth, we are a dead nation. We need not to go back to the dead empires of Rome and Greece for illustration and example." And this was a claim against birth control that was being advocated for by some people. And this again, you know, is, while it's not necessarily a eugenic argument, it is this aspect of, yeah, we control to be able to preserve the empire. So what are sort of the broader ideas that come from this? Well, something that I was really thinking about is, what do we consider rational and what don't we consider questioning? Because of course eugenics was something that we didn't consider questioning. In the past, you go back and you look at sort of what rationality is, and that wasn't even questioned by the men in society who are claiming to have it, you know? So it's just, what do we consider questioning, what don't we, and what is the harm of not asking these questions? Another important thing is that these narratives never fully disappeared. You know, when I started studying eugenics, I never thought that this would be such a big discussion that's coming up today too, that more people understand what it is, and that you can like search it up right now on Google and go to news and you'll see people are talking about eugenics happening. So it's just insane. And also the Eugenics Society, which started out as the Eugenics Education Society to spread information about eugenics. And it was, you know, it held these international forums at the time in the 1900s. It never disappeared. It was rebranded as the Adelphi Genetics Forum, and it still exists. This rebranding was done in 2021. Before that, it did have another name, but then it's just all of these organizations and stuff that led to this happening are mainly still around. So when we think about empire, population, and politics, frankly, a colony and dominion that was obsessed and focused on population control from its beginnings, there's this whole myth that like eugenics or a certain narrative or something can save a nation. But I think the core thing to get out of all of this is that a nation is made up of the people who live within it. And all of these narratives about removing certain people from discourse or removing certain people from being able to populate a nation, or all of this sort of ideas about certain people being tied to one specific narrative, was always, I think, more detrimental than it was successful. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions or comments, I left my email down there, so please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merritt. We'll have Sonia Boone now for her talk, and then we will get to questions, I promise.
Before I start, I do want to say thank you to Terry Bishop Sterling, who introduced me to the letters to Smallwood in the first place, way back in 2009-ish, and look where we are now. I'm still reading them. So Confederation was and remains deeply contentious, as we all know. The vote to join Canada was close, and many will still argue against Confederation. But no matter the ultimate outcome, whether debating ideas, venting outrage, imagining futures, or all of the above, that period was a period of incredible political and social engagement. No matter what people voted, no matter where they were leaning, it was a moment of radical possibility. The debates and referenda were about the possibility of rebirth, not just about what Newfoundland and Labrador would be in the future, but what it could be. The future was wide open. And this is really visible in the letters written to Joey Smallwood, which are housed at the Archives and Special Collections Division at the Memorial University Library. These number in their thousands. They come from men, women, and children from virtually every community across Newfoundland and Labrador. And they're smart, they're engaged, and they're passionate. They reveal an electorate invested in the debates, committed to the future, and also fully aware of the political power of their votes. While Smallwood's vision ultimately won the day, it's abundantly clear that he couldn't take voters or their votes for granted. And in letter after letter, even the most ardent of Confederates reminded him that they were expecting results. As a woman from Woody Island wrote, quote, "Both my husband and I stood by you and your party in each election by giving our votes. Now we're going to trust you to stand by us." They may have given their vote, but it wasn't free. Correspondents wrote to Smallwood for myriad reasons. Some offered practical suggestions to improve the lives of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. A man from St. John's, for example, suggested the introduction of a species of fast-breeding rabbits from Australia that could improve food security. Another, writing from Bay Verte, offered his ideas for improving mail service in outport communities. Others wrote to Smallwood to share more personal or local community concerns, discussing everything from the cost of healthcare and groceries to the state of roads, the challenges facing abandoned war brides, the need for local telephone systems, and practical benefits of things like the baby bonus. Others wrote about the political process itself, with some writing about the political risks involved in voting for Confederation, and others taking Smallwood seriously to task and decrying the cause. The vast majority signed their own letters, but a small and intriguing subset used pseudonyms or didn't sign their letters at all. A person from Carbonear, writing as a disappointed Confederate, took Smallwood to task about the cost of living, noting in particular the price of apples and oranges. As they write, quote, "Now we are the 10th province of Canada, and we still have to pay 30 to 40 cents per dozen for not very large apples. Every child still has to have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 cents to get an apple for lunch, and all other fruit, a lot of it coming from Canada. It makes me sick to hear all the preaching about TB. Give the poor children the chance to buy cheap apples and oranges and other fruit." Choosing anonymity was both practical and political. Many correspondents indicated that they listened to Smallwood on the radio and they knew their concerns might be publicly shared. As one correspondent from Placentia West wrote, "I'm not sending this letter for you to broadcast it. I'm only sending for help." Correspondents likely also knew that any letter sent to Smallwood would go through a secretary. In the words of a poet from St. John's West, "Dear Secretary, in case you open this letter, please do not destroy it, as we wish the Premier to read it, and do not put it away somewhere where it'll be forgotten about. With the sender's permission to advertise it anywhere you choose and hope to gain you more votes in the coming election." Accompanying this note was a 4-verse poem titled "The Liberals, the Reliever of Poverty." So too were correspondents likely aware that their letters could possibly end up on other government desks as well. Indeed, one man from St. John's asked that his letter be kept confidential because he was, quote, "in an unfortunate position with the money men." Finally, they would have been fully aware of the politics of small communities. Their words could have repercussions, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of their extended families and their communities. So I want to focus on a selection of letters written by women using pseudonyms. The concerns I've just mentioned may have been particularly acute for women, the majority of whom were likely wholly or almost wholly economically dependent on their fathers, husbands, or sons. The social programs Confederation promised, and the family allowance and widow's pension in particular, would directly benefit women, some of whom would have cash of their own for the very first time in their lives. On April 29, 1949, a, quote, drunkard's wife wrote to Smallwood from Lameline area. She wrote about bootlegging, an issue that impacted her life directly. "I'm asking you to change the smuggling," she wrote. "My home is a hell to me through the cause of liquor. If it wasn't brought in from St. Pierre, my husband could not buy it. He cannot go to St. Pierre to get. He can buy it every day near his home. The colors do be sent out to keep this thing down, but it makes no difference to the small boats such as dories, and so the captains of these little boats take clearances. They go without them, and many times when it's rough for the colors to stay out in the bay, coming on night, they go into Grand Bank or Lameline for harbor during the night. That's just the time for Mr. Bootlegger to make their dash for home. I trust these big Canadian colors will stay in the St. Pierre waters or out in the bay to prevent and keep liquor from being brought to our homes and breaking the hearts of mothers and wives and causing so much unhappiness and want in many homes where unity and comfort could reign." The drunkard's wife was very cautious about her identity. Not only did she use a pseudonym, but she was also very vague about where she was living, stating in a postscript that this letter is sent from Lameline District somewhere between Point Crew and Lawn, and it's a true statement, please work on it right away. Anonymity was vital for the drunkard's wife. In her letter, she indicated that many men were involved in bootlegging. Putting her name to her letter would not only put her personal and family security at risk, both socially and legally, but could also put families in other communities at risk. By remaining anonymous, the drunkard's wife could raise relevant concerns while assuming minimal risk. And anonymity also allowed for more boldness. She indicated that Smallwood was welcome to publish her letter in any paper. Smallwood received another pseudonymous letter right around the same time. This one, 22nd April 1949, was sent by, quote, the girl given a raw deal. Writing as a shop girl, this 20-year-old detailed long work hours and poor pay, writing, I've been working there for quite a few years. I'm doing the hardest kind of work, where I have to be on my legs from 9 in the morning till 6 at evening. I also have to work Monday and Saturday nights. I have to ask for a raise, and with great difficulty, I get one after a while. I started with $22.50 per month. I'm only getting $37.50 now. Don't you think, sir, that's a bit on the skinny side for a girl to pay her board, buy clothes, and pay unemployment insurance with? She observed that her two sisters were paid even less, saying the worst kind of a raw deal. As Carrie Neal has observed, a woman's dedication to engage in paid labor in or outside the home was largely determined by her age, marital status, and class background. Young, unmarried women who worked outside the home were likely contributing to family economies, and many would be expected to leave paid labor on their own marriages. They could also expect to earn significantly less than men. Linda Cullum, writing about fish and blueberry processing plant workers, observes that women's rates of pay were about half of those of men during this period, a statistic echoed more broadly in the 1961 federal census. A raw deal, indeed. As with the drunkard's wife, anonymity was essential for the girl given a raw deal. She risked not only her own position, but those of her younger sisters. And given that all three were likely contributing to family coffers, she risked her family's economic security as well. Similar concerns underpin a letter from a mother in St. John's, just signed as a mother, who detailed her daughter's poor working conditions at a clothing factory. Though she didn't include the name of the factory, she was nevertheless concerned for her daughter's position, writing, Please, Mr. Smallwood, do not mention that you got a letter from anyone at that factory, as they will fire my daughter. A month later, in May 1949, Smallwood received a letter signed Worried Widow. Like the drunkard's wife, Worried Widow didn't include her address or even her community name. Worried Widow wanted information about widow's pension. I have heard over the radio all the speeches concerning the old age pension, baby bonus, etc., she wrote, but I haven't heard about widows. Could she count on an increase, or would she continue to get $10 per quarter, the same as what she received before Confederation? The pension amount was a matter of concern. As another woman, writing as, quote, a worker and widow, observed, the sum widows were receiving by the Commission government was not enough for sweetening for their tea. Widows' pensions were the subject of many letters to Smallwood, and for correspondence, the particulars around their pensions were complicated. Widows were ineligible to receive pensions if they had unmarried sons, for example, but even without unmarried sons, some widows were told by relieving officers that there was nothing for them, while others had their pension amounts cut for reasons they didn't understand. The power of the relieving officer to determine their economic fate was significant. And given this, writing anonymously could offer some women the possibility of sharing their concerns and advocating for change in ways that didn't risk relationships they had to maintain with those in charge of administering pensions and benefits in the communities in which they lived. On the surface, these letters and others like them might seem like nothing more than complaints, a litany of concerns born out of self-interest. But I think there's something more important at play. By choosing pseudonyms, these women made possible a sense of collective political identity, something that was particularly important for women in this era. The National Convention in 1946, the referendum in 1948, and the subsequent election of 1949 held resonance for women. They'd only received the franchise in 1925 and hadn't been able to exercise it for over a decade. Active engagement in the political process was entirely novel for many women, the first time they were able to assert their own concerns, and as a result, the first time they were able to imagine themselves as part of a larger collective. For other women, the convention, referenda, and election would have been seen as welcome returns to a practice for which they and their foremothers, as Margot pointed out the other day, had fought long and hard. After all, in 1928, when women of Newfoundland, and again, Newfoundland at the time without Labrador in its name, over the age of 25, were first able to cast their ballots, 90% of them voted. Seen in this light, the letters written by the women of Newfoundland and Labrador can be seen as a reclaiming of a political identity they'd only just barely begun to enjoy when the Commission of Government was installed. The pseudonymous letters gesture towards an understanding of shared oppressions based on gender and class, and from there, towards shared visions for the future. By positioning themselves not as individuals, but more broadly as wives, mothers, widows, and workers, they open space for other women to situate themselves in their experiences within those identities, and this in turn allowed them to advocate for larger scale social change. Indeed, in most instances, the anonymous women noted that their concerns were not individual, but shared. Consider, for example, a June 1949 letter signed by the, quote, widows of the West End, which is honestly the best name for a group. Here, the collective is overt. The author wrote that she was, quote, writing this on behalf of dozens of widows. By signing her letter in the name of the collective, she asserted the widows of the West End as an important voting bloc. While not as explicit in her signature, so too did Worried Widow argue that her concerns were shared by others, writing that many widows here on the island are thinking the same thing and wondering what's for widows. Implicit in such claims is the political power of widows. The relationship between Smallwood and the widows was reciprocal. In the words of a worker and widow, it's up to you to do your utmost on behalf of widows, and we'll do ours for you. This sense of collective political identity is also evident in letters by, quote, a mother, the girl given a raw deal, and the drunkard's wife. The girl given a raw deal began by outlining her personal concerns, linked in the experiences of her two sisters, and then located all three of them within the broader group of shop girls, writing in her postscript, P.S. There are many more girls the same way. Similarly, quote, a mother advocated for her daughter, but made it clear that her concerns extended to all the girls working at the factory. I pray for your help, she wrote, and try to do something for those girls, as some are fed up with this small pay, and the next thing they'll be on the streets, and then they're ruined forever. Please, sir, give this your immediate attention. For a mother, the issue was not just economic, but also social. Without proper pay, these workers would end up in trouble. For both the girl given the raw deal and a mother, this collective identity, unmarried young women workers, was central to their visions for change. These letters reveal that women were actively engaged in the political process and clearly aware of the political power of their collective identities. By choosing pseudonyms, they tapped into that collective, in the process amplifying and multiplying individual voices. In this way, anonymity as group identity can be read as a form of solidarity through which they could imagine themselves as integral elements of a renewed and revitalized polity. Leveraging their identities not as individuals, but as wives, mothers, widows, and workers allowed them to make powerful claims on behalf of specific communities and to speak in a collective voice in a period of profound change.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonia. What an incredible set of papers. And we do, fortunately, I think, have about a good 5, maybe 10 minutes or something for some questions for our speakers. We're just getting the WebEx reset up here now so we've got Andrea and Tracy and Merritt for questions for those folks. And I'm just going to make sure, does Sonia, would one of those mics turn on in case we've got you?
Does it work?
Yes, it does. Okay, amazing. So on that note, and I've got Darcy here for folks in the audience, so we're ready to go with questions. I see Margot. Excellent.
I scarcely know where to begin. All of the presentations have been so fantastic. But I guess this is for Sonia. In a way, it relates to Merritt's paper, too. The traditional interpretation of how we got into Confederation, of course, is that it involves a slightly higher percentage of women than men voting for it. And it's always attributed to the baby bonus. And now it strikes me that this is exactly a mirror. It's a cultural assumption as to why women are voting for it. But what these letters are showing is a much broader range of concerns. And I think it's fascinating. In the absent kind of public opinion surveys, the letters can be read really as why women, a slightly higher percentage of women, voted for Confederation. So thank you for this just a phenomenal paper. I think it just throws a whole different perspective on that vote.
Thank you for that. I will say one of the things that Vicki and I noticed as we were, and I'm sure everybody who contributed noticed, was that a lot of the narratives around Confederation, whether it was about Protestants versus Catholics, about this versus that, it's far more complicated. When you read the letters, it becomes very obvious that there were far more things, far more currents at play, and people were very invested for a lot of different reasons.
Actually wondered if any of the women, how many of the women, we wouldn't know, were daughters of those who fought for suffrage. I mean, it's an interesting question. But.
Super interesting question. Nobody mentioned it. Vicki, did you see that anywhere? But super interesting question.
Right, always. Any other questions here in the audience? We've got a few. Oh, wonderful. See another hand up.
Interested in the Labrador work in particular, but I wondered how the posting of that material on the website has been greeted, whether it's encouraged other kinds of questions or broader discussion about women in Nunatsiavut.
Tracy, do you want to? Well, I'll say something. You can say something after if you want. Yeah, so the digital stories originally were on Facebook, and they were widely shared and commented on. I think the core group of people, especially the advisory group who worked on the project, have, well, those are the conversations that I've been involved in anyway, in terms of thinking about how these stories all relate to each other and you know, how they show this unique type of leadership. I know they've been popular within Nunatsiavut, but I'm not sure, you know, I can't identify any other discussions coming out of that besides the ones I've been involved in.
Was there any pushback from communities or other groups or anyone?
Sorry, Tracy, you jump in. There wasn't pushback, but there was interest. I know the Department of Culture within Nunatsiavut has been talking for a while about doing a similar thing with men. And like, yeah, doing a equivalent project that would focus on men and I don't know, helping young men, especially who are dealing with difficult times, I guess. You know, see themselves as leaders and as appreciated within the community.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I also want to note that I believe we've got another person. I think it's Julia Ladies joined us online, has her camera on. And would you like to ask a question from our online folks? No? Okay, just wanted to double check in case. Glad to see you. We have time, I think, for one, maybe two more. Are there any other questions, any other takers here in the audience? Oh, I see one more there. Thank you.
I have a question for Andrea or anyone else on the panel, and it's around what you just talked about in terms of pushback, in terms of the stories that you shared of women, and now the men wanting an opportunity to share. And something that was raised here yesterday by Lisa Moore, and I guess young men feeling disenfranchised within society today. I happen to work on a series of videos around women in science and engineering. And that organization was very successful in encouraging young women in Newfoundland and Labrador to pursue careers in science and engineering. And that started in the mid-1980s. And I think the number of women that have been involved in or gone into careers in science and engineering has increased dramatically around that. But there has been pushback in recent years about now boys are being left out. Does anyone have any comments or suggestions or questions around that?
Just for our presenters here or online, Sharon's question was sort of about, you know, that tension again around pushbacks around the idea of, you know, centering women in those stories, but also that as a tension of pushback, but also the identified need about young men feeling disenfranchised, and some of the discourse that kind of, you know, surrounds these projects and how we think about that. And we're just wondering sort of broadly for the panel, from what you see in your research or in your activism and things like that, if there was a comment that you'd like to share. I know I think the mic might have went maybe in and out a little there.
Well, just in terms of again, of our project, it's not that there was pushback at all. I think people really recognize the need to celebrate the women in our project anyway. I think it's just more people recognizing the power that had and the value it had, and wanting to share it with yeah, a group of men who are facing you know, difficulty and challenging times in Nunatsiavut. So, but it's not, absolutely not in terms of pushback. I don't see it that way at all.
Thank you so much. Well, we're, I think, pretty much at time here. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists, to thank Andrea Proctor, Tracy Evan Rice, to Merritt Ebsary, and Sonia Boone. You've started us off today, I think, with incredible conversations and complex things to think about. And I thank you for your time